Welcome you all here, friends of WiSER, members of Trinity College academic institutions and others, partners, and people who've just come out of interest to help celebrate International Women's Week. Thank you all for coming. On behalf of WiSER as Acting Director, I just want to hand over to or introduce our chair for this evening, Professor Linda Hogan, who is Vice Provost of Trinity College Dublin and also Professor of Ecumenics. Her specialist areas of study are theological ethics, human rights and gender, and she authored a book From Women's Experience to Feminist Theology. And she is going to be in charge for the rest of the evening and introduce our guest speaker. So thank you again.
So thank you very much, Eileen, and I suppose I should begin by saying it's quite a distance from feminist theology to the themes of this evening, though I think maybe there are some commonalities. It's really my great honour and pleasure to introduce our very eminent speaker for this evening's lecture, Professor Nancy Hopkins. Professor Hopkins is a developmental biologist and the Amgen Professor of Biology at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. Professor Hopkins obtained a PhD from Harvard University and was a postdoctoral fellow there and also at the Cold Spring Harbor Laboratory. In 1973, she joined the MIT faculty as an assistant professor in the Center for Cancer Research. And her lab worked in three main areas: the mechanisms for leukemogenesis of mouse RNA tumor viruses. I have no idea what that is. The genetics of early vertebrate development using the zebrafish, and the use of the zebrafish as a cancer model. And currently she's on sabbatical studying cancer prevention. I suppose in addition to her eminence as a scientist, Professor Hopkins has really made a very significant contribution to this field by leading an ongoing effort to end discrimination against women in science. In the year 2000, she was appointed by the then MIT President Vest to the MIT administration to co-chair the first Council on Faculty Diversity, and she worked with Professor Robert Brown on that. The resulting efforts by MIT were recognized by President Clinton and are credited with improving the numbers and status of women faculty at MIT and also nationally in the USA. She's lectured widely in the United States and also in Europe and Asia on the underrepresentation of women in STEM fields, in academia in particular. She's also a member of the National Academy of Sciences, a fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, and a member of the Institute of Medicine of the National Academy of Science. Her lecture this evening is entitled Approaches to Equality for Women Faculty in Sciences, Changing Institutions, Changing Individuals, Lessons from the MIT Story. So it's my great pleasure to welcome you to give us your address.
Thank you very much, and thank you so much for coming. For people who organized my visit, it's just remarkable. You can be in New York City 1 minute and the next minute taking a nap over here in Trinity College and nice, beautiful rooms here. Wonderful, I appreciate it. Well, I did have one slide before that one. I should say that I think in the United States, we actually think of ourselves as being leaders in civil rights, equal rights, women's rights. However, it should be noted that as of today, there has never been a woman president or even a vice president of the United States. The United States is still congratulating itself on having elected an African-American man to be president, and very rightly so. It was an extraordinary event. But African-American men comprise 7.5% of the United States population, while women are 50%. Nor are most people shocked by this picture. Women got the vote over 90 years ago, but we haven't been able to elect a woman president. So it's not just politics where there are so few women at the top. The percent of women is small at the top of many fields, including my field of science. things are changing, but it is slow. Today I'm going to talk about changes for women in science that I saw in my lifetime, which is now quite long, and what caused them. I think this is really a story about how social change happens and why it takes so long. If there was one thing that could come out of it, perhaps there's somebody sitting in this audience who can figure out how to accelerate social change. That would really have a monumental impact. As I say, I think that in a way, for me, I think solving this particular problem at every level, in every country, may really be the issue of our time. It's been said that by people. I think it's really true. Its time has come. Okay, so moving right on to this story of this one example, which is really the example of women in science at MIT at the faculty level. In the United States, people have spent literally hundreds of millions of dollars, hundreds of thousands of women hours, and 5 decades addressing the underrepresentation of women in science, technology, engineering, and math, the so-called STEM fields. And certainly we're not alone, as my presence here attests. But there's a very odd thing about this picture. If you look back at how women have advanced in the STEM fields over the past 50 years in the United States and their continued underrepresentation, you have to wonder whether we really are serious about this goal. It's true that people have worked very hard to get young women interested in science, but it's also true that a series of gender-based barriers have held them back. So how can both of these things be true? It turns out that the barriers that hold women back are often invisible, very much like the missing female United States presidents. Furthermore, it can take decades to identify these barriers, decades to find a solution for them, and another decade to enforce and monitor the solutions. So I think this is why it takes so long to increase the number of women in science, and why the reality of women's experiences who become scientists sometimes seem to contradict the stated goal that we actually want women in science. So when I was young, I was absolutely unaware of these issues. I just wanted to be a molecular biologist, desperately. But in the process of being a molecular biologist, I gradually did come to see, I think, why there are so few women in science. In fact, the more I've learned about this, the more amazed I am that there are so many women in science. And after 20 years on the faculty at MIT, I had an opportunity to work on this issue with other tenured women faculty and with the MIT administration. And I think it was an extraordinary experience. And I'm going to talk about what I learned, and I'll leave heavily on the MIT story. But everything I say about MIT is certainly true of every other university I've visited in the United States. So this is using MIT data, but it's really not the MIT story. It's the story of this issue in the United States. So I'm going to briefly describe the barriers that were identified, how they've been removed, and the prospects for women's full participation in science. I'll talk just about the underrepresentation of women on the science and engineering faculties, because that's the one that I've worked on and off over the past 18 years while also being a scientist. So what I learned is that if you want to understand this issue, it helps to look at two things. You have to look at the numbers, for which you need really good data, and look at them as a function of time, look at the pipeline, how did it change and why, and then look at the experiences of the women who came into these fields as students and then became faculty. And when you put these two things together, at least some of the mystery sort of starts to evaporate, and you see why it's been hard to change this. So a term that came to describe the number of women on science faculties in American universities has been the leaky pipeline. A lot of women start and few get to the top. This slide shows what the percent of women at MIT looks like over time. So it goes back to 1901 up through 2011. It shows the percent. This is the percent of women who are undergraduates, graduate students, and then the bottom curve is the faculty in science and engineering at MIT. So 45% of the undergraduates, 29% of the graduate students, and 17% of the science and engineering faculty. And that's the sort of drop-off that we talked about, 45, 29, 17. This picture can be divided into two distinct segments. Before the mid-1960s to early 70s, except during the 2 world wars when the men were away so the women comprised a higher percent of total, there were essentially no women on the faculty. There were none, and there were very few students. And then suddenly in the late 1960s and early 70s, the curves began to rise together. So why did you get this very sudden, abrupt change? And the turning point is the passage of the 1964 Civil Rights Act, subsequent affirmative action laws and regulations, and the women's liberation movement that altered people's thinking about the role of women in society. So in 1964, it became illegal to deny women access to jobs based on gender. In addition, the numbers of women began to climb as majors, and women began to be hired onto the faculty. So people assumed, it's just a matter of time before this faculty will reflect the students we train. But the change did not happen nearly as rapidly as people expected. And the next slide shows in greater detail what happened for women on the science faculty at MIT. You have to look in great detail at the data. So the previous slide was the percent of women in the different levels. And this slide just shows the actual number of women faculty in the 6 departments of science at MIT as a function of time. Those departments are biology, chemistry, physics, math, earth, atmosphere, planetary sciences, and brain and cognitive sciences, neuroscience. In 1960, there were no women faculty in those 6 current departments of science. They began to be hired in the 60s and 70s. By 1970, there were 2 women. Okay, so the Civil Rights Act is 1964. By 1970, you have 2. And then suddenly you'll see the curve shoots up, right? Shoots way up, tenfold, gets up to 20 women and 264 men. Then after, so 1971 is the turning point. So why is there this sharp, sudden rise? It turns out the 1964 Civil Rights Act, which made discrimination in hiring illegal, was not sufficient to actually cause something to happen. It required pressure in the form of affirmative action laws to bring a significant number of women onto the faculty. 1971 saw the implementation of affirmative action regulations under the Civil Rights Act. And these required that universities submit written plans to hire women and do so or risk losing their federal funding. And that got people's attention. So I believe that without civil rights and without affirmative action laws, there probably would still be no women on the faculties of America's research universities. That's my belief. Women were hired because of these laws. I was approximately number 10 on this curve. So 1973, I can see right in the middle of that steep rise. I was superbly trained. I'd done very visible research as a graduate student at Harvard. I'm certain, well, that's overconfident. I believe, had I been a man and applied for the job, I would have been hired. But I actually hadn't thought of applying for a faculty job. I was actively recruited by MIT and by Harvard for my credentials, yes, right credentials, right time, right place, and I assume because there was a legal mandate to do so. And then you'll notice that the curve got up to about 20 women and plateaued for 20 years. If you take the curve from the School of Engineering, it's superimposable on this curve in the early years. Nothing, and then it shoots up, same point, to 10, and then plateaus also. I'll come back to the plateaus and the forces that drove the numbers up again. But I think the really important lesson that can be learned from looking at a picture like this and the previous picture is time alone does not fix this problem. I think there's a perception, belief that if we just wait, everything's changing, we've seen change, so if we just wait longer, there'll be more change. No, change happens because people actually do something. The numbers change because they do a lot. In this case, as extreme as the Civil Rights Act, the affirmative action laws, and the women's liberation movement was what it took to create change. Second thing I've learned is, in retrospect, it's very obvious that not being able to get a job is a serious impediment to your career. But what is not so obvious is that simply making it illegal to not to hire women was not sufficient, that it took more than that to actually make it happen. And I think what's taken us 50 years to understand is that on the other side of the very visible barrier of not being able to vote, not being able to get the job, there's a whole series of barriers that are actually invisible and unanticipated, and it takes a long time to identify them, and they can be just as effective at keeping women out as the fact that they couldn't be hired. So I'm going to, as I talk along, keep a running list here of the barriers that held women back in STEM fields and the solutions that have been used in the United States to remove these barriers. So obstacle 1, before 1964 you couldn't be hired. Solution, legal and social pressure. And I think it's important to, I know it's a long time ago, but I ask myself this question often today as we continue to work on this issue 50 years later. Are we really doing the right thing, or should we consider legal actions? I think it's something you always have to ask yourself. Look back in time and say, what really worked, okay? And are we doing the right things even today? Okay, so I think the next thing is, when you see the kind of slides I showed with this sudden rise in women, the thing that pops into people's mind immediately is, but what about quality? When you see a graph that suddenly shoots up and you had to go out and hire these women or haul them in as students, people say, but didn't you have to lower the standards to find people like Nancy Hopkins to put on your faculty? Okay, so here's the answer as far as I understand it. When MIT first began to encourage women to apply in large numbers as undergraduate students, they found that they had to lower the math requirement average test score on the SAT by 10 points in order to, for the women relative to the men. And the reason they were willing to do it is because they found that the SAT score did not predict how well women would do in math courses when they got to MIT. So men performed, you can almost predict how people will do in the classes from how they do in the tests. They could predict how the men would do, but the women outperformed. They did very well relative to their scores. The reason is that the SAT score reflects very much the amount of math that people have in high school and middle school. And so 30 or 40 years ago, most women weren't taught much math in school because people didn't think women needed to learn math. So by temporarily changing the criteria, but not by lowering the standards for ability, MIT was able to bring more women into as undergraduates. Of course, today this is no longer necessary, and the result of doubling the size of the pool from which MIT draws its students and other colleges is to make the competition insanely competitive. I feel extremely sorry for all these people because the pool gets bigger, the competition gets greater, and the scores just keep going up for everybody. And the people who come to MIT now perform equally. Actually, there's a rumor, this is off the record, I didn't put my written talk, that women do better. But we don't really want to put that down on paper. I'm not sure it's true. I have avoided looking at the data. I don't even want to know. But suffice it to say, men and women do equally well. And what about the faculty who are hired? Even back in those days when the pool was very small, when people were hired as a result of affirmative action. Certainly at a place like MIT, to ever lower the standard would be suicidal, not just for MIT, but for the people you tried to bring in. So they never did it, and the people they brought in from the beginning got tenure at the same rates as men, right from the start. And later on, I'll show you some of the credentials of the women who were hired, and you'll see that they've achieved at the same levels as men. So even from the beginning, those women achieved at the same level as men. Okay, so that's something about the numbers of where we come from and where we are. And what about the experiences of the women who were on the leading edge of these curves, the first women to come in as students, to become graduate students, to become faculty? What did they experience in this community that was claimed to be trying to attract women into science? Well, I arrived at MIT in 1973 as a junior faculty, and soon after I met a woman who had been appointed as an ombudsperson by the MIT president to deal with issues that were affecting female students and faculty. She told me that the biggest problem she was grappling with was an issue I had never even heard of. It was called sexual harassment. She said female students were having trouble dealing with professors who wanted to date them. I didn't understand what she was really talking about or why this would be a big problem. I mean, why would you not expect that? This would happen. You put men and women together, of course things were going to happen. I just didn't understand it. I didn't even realize I myself had possibly been the object of harassment. I didn't feel I'd ever been harassed. However, here's a funny story. When I was an undergraduate in college, I was working in a lab, and one day a great and famous scientist was coming to give a lecture in the university, and I was very excited. I was at my desk, I was working away, and the door of my office flew open, and there stood the famous scientist. It happened to be Francis Crick, and he came up behind me, put his hands on my breast and said, "What are you working on?" And my thought was not, oh, I'm being sexually harassed, because I didn't know what the word was, didn't know anything about it. And I never thought of that. I just thought, oh, how can I get out of this without embarrassing the great Francis Crick? This is so awkward. And I think that was sort of the attitude before sexual harassment came to be identified by a name. And I managed to get out of it very gracefully, and so was able to attend the party at Jim Watson's house that evening and be nice to Frances and everybody, and it went on. And I think women just dealt with it that way. It was not an issue that you saw as anything particularly unusual. However, at that time, there were people a lot smarter than me. They were radical feminist lawyers, people I didn't know anything about and probably wouldn't have had much to do with, who understood the implications of this sort of thing, that when a professor treated a student that way, it was possible that he didn't really see them as a potential future equal. And so those people realized that if this behavior persisted, women would never be equal in the workplace. You couldn't be equal. And therefore, they reasoned that sexual harassment should be illegal under the gender discrimination laws, Title VII, Title IX of the Civil Rights Act. And so they took a decade to fight their way to the Supreme Court, and indeed they made it illegal. So the result is that today, federal law requires every workplace post a set of rules to prevent sexual harassment. Otherwise, you risk being sued. As again, from start to finish, it took 30 years of women going into these situations, identifying a problem, getting someone to pay attention, radical people taking it on, getting to the Supreme Court, making a law, and another 10 years to enforce it. And by the way, after you've done that, you still have to keep enforcing it. The law still exists, it's still on the books, and people still enforce it to this day. And if you remove the law and remove the books, you'd probably go backwards. And I think that, again, I mention this problem because it's so old-fashioned that it's, but you tend to forget, again, that it was there and how long it took to get rid of it. And I think that it's fair to say that sexual harassment also belongs on the list of issues that drove some young women away in that era. As I say, some people, had good experiences, some didn't. But I think that it was one of them. And again, it shows you how hard it is to solve these problems and that it took legal action to fix this one. Okay, what next? Okay, so then those women, they get through the college, the ones who lucky don't have this problem derailing them. The next problem we discovered as students came into graduate school was that many of them didn't have mentors. They were kind of lost, floating lost around. They just weren't mentored. As a result, formal mentoring programs had to be devised. They didn't exist to my knowledge. When I was a student, I never heard of mentoring programs. People got mentored because the faculty looked like the students. They took them under their wing and they mentored them. But when women came in, people fell through the cracks and mentoring programs were needed. Ironically, I want to mention that my mentor as a scientist was Jim Watson, and without him I could not have become a scientist. I did work in his lab as an undergraduate. He encouraged me to be a scientist. He pushed me to be a scientist. He demanded that I be a scientist. He was a fantastic mentor. So not everybody, though, was as fortunate as I was. So there you go, Watson and Crick, two sides of a coin. Well, it's a long story, but anyway, we'll come back to that later maybe. Okay, so the other thing is, that as the women at these leading edges identified these problems and moved on, things got solved, they didn't leave the problem behind. So each one of these things, sexual harassment, affected women at every level. The need for mentors, as you move through, becomes really a need for sponsors. As you move toward the top, you need people who draw you into the highest level professional activity. So it never ends. So these problems got identified, and then they continue. So what's next? Okay. Well, during the transition from getting the PhD to joining the faculty was when young women were likely to encounter what I thought naively when I was young was the only barrier to women's advancement in science, which was the family work problem. When I was a graduate student and postdoc at Harvard, I thought it was clear why there were so few women on science faculties. High-level molecular biology, which was the type I was interested in, required that you work 70 to 80 hours a week. So how could you be that kind of a scientist and also be a mother? So I found a very simple solution for this problem in my personal situation. After obtaining my PhD and doing my postdoc, I got divorced. And then, just to be on the safe side, I decided I would not remarry and I would not have children. Problem solved. Okay. Well, the world has changed. So women in my generation, I think, saw this as a problem that was a choice. It grew out of a biological difference between men and women. What could you do? It really did not occur to me that this was a barrier that someone could actually remove on my behalf. Okay? Shocking. Shocking. So daunting was this obstacle that in my generation, you instinctively knew not to talk about children. The word baby, like a four-letter word, do not say this word in the workplace. Because if you did, people might think either you weren't serious about science or you regretted your life choices or something terrible. When policies were first developed in universities for family leave, women faculty were actually afraid to use them because of the stigma that was attached to them. So men took family leave, but women did not. It took 2 more decades to change things so that women could actually use the family leave policies without the stigma. And today they do. Whether the stigma is totally gone could be discussed among us. So the question of whether to decide to have children or not contributed to the leaky pipeline is almost an absurd question, really. But it didn't stop but people would used to say, oh, no, it's not really. People can do it. Look, so-and-so did it. Mary did it. Sue did it. What's your problem? But this is absurd. It did, and it still does. And very large studies done by Marion Mason and Mark Goulden at University of California, Berkeley, have confirmed that having children causes women to leave the academic pipeline preferentially. Some people say just thinking about having children causes women to leave the pipeline. So in my opinion, this remains one of the significant barriers to women's advancement in many workplaces. And as for the last barrier, it took me 20 years on the faculty to understand it, and I will tell this one from a personal point of view because I was involved with other women at MIT in identifying it. So like most women of my generation, I joined the faculty at MIT as a young scientist, believing that civil rights and affirmative action laws, the women's movement, had eliminated something called gender discrimination. I did not expect to encounter it in my lifetime. Over the next 15 years, I found out I was wrong. I found out it did exist, and I figured it out by watching how other women were treated. What I saw was that when a man and a woman made scientific discoveries of equal importance, neither the discovery nor the woman was valued equally to the man's discovery or the man. Sometimes the woman didn't get any credit at all. She could almost be invisible. These observations were impossible for me to believe, actually, because science is a merit-based occupation, right? So how could it be true? But after years of watching through the 1970s, 80s, and 90s how women scientists' contributions were treated, I was certain that the women and their science were undervalued. Amazingly, it took me another 5 years to know it was even true of me, not just other women. It's much easier to say, I'm really not good enough, than it is to say, I was badly treated. But it's easier to see it in how other women are treated. The realization that this inequality happened in science was really extraordinarily demoralizing. Sometimes I wanted to quit science. I loved it with such a passion. I don't think I could have lived without science, actually. But I had given up a lot for it, was happy to do that. But when you realize that no matter what you discover, you'll never really be equal, I can't tell you how demoralizing that is. And I knew no other woman would be either. The other thing that was difficult about this in that era, it was a very difficult time in my life, I thought I was the only person on earth who had figured this out. And you couldn't tell anybody, because who was going to believe you? Plus, if you told them, they would think that if you complained about bias, it must mean you weren't good enough. If you were really good enough, if you discovered the structure of DNA, they would have to give you the Nobel Prize and treat you as an equal, right? Alas, I finally realized if you were a woman, you could make a Nobel Prize level discovery and quite possibly not win the Nobel Prize or even be viewed as having done critically important work. In time, it dawned on me that this very strange truth that I had discovered, the fact that work done by women was undervalued, might be the most important scientific discovery I had ever made. It was so important, it deserved a Nobel Prize. What I didn't know and did not learn for another decade was that the discovery I had made so painfully over 20 years had long since been made. Furthermore, in 2002, a Nobel Prize was awarded for this discovery. The prize went to Kahneman. It's the psychology of unconscious bias. So it was psychologists who discovered the phenomenon in the 1970s and 1980s by a series of very remarkable experiments. Their work demonstrated the irrationality of the human brain to make accurate judgments or see truths that contradict our unconscious biases and beliefs. In the case of gender bias, the result of unconscious bias is to judge identical accomplishment as less good if we think it was done by a woman. The type of experiment I think many people know about in this audience, and that is you take a manuscript, you Xerox it, you put a man's name on one copy and a woman's on the other, and you send them out to review, and people think the man's work is better than the woman's, even though they're identical. And so for a related finding involving irrational decisions, the 2002 Nobel Prize in Economics went to the psychologist Kahneman. As for unconscious gender bias, one of the most surprising things about it is, although it shouldn't be surprising, it shows you how little we've understood this. This bias, it doesn't matter if you send the manuscript to a panel of men or women. Both men and women think the man's better for identical work. Oh boy. Okay. Well, there are enormous consequences, obviously, to unconscious bias in the workplace. It can affect how you're treated, compensation, whether you're hired in the first place, because it causes the undervaluation of intellectual work. Alas, I didn't know about this at the time that I had come really, I think, independently over 20 years of observation to understand that this thing existed. Again, I didn't know its name, but it was clear that it was happening. And I was struggling at that time to do research I was very excited about, but I couldn't get the space I needed, a very small amount of space, even though I was a tenured professor and had less space than other tenured professors. So I got a tape measure, I went around MIT, I measured all the rooms and labs, and I made little floor plans to demonstrate that I had less space, but I couldn't get anybody to look at them. So I decided I was going to work my way up through the administration until I could find somebody who would look at my floor plans and give me my 200 square feet of space. But on my way to the president's office, I happened to muster the courage to approach a very distinguished female colleague to get her approval of a letter I was planning to send to the president. I thought, I don't want to offend him, and I want to make sure he understands this, so he does something about it. I better run this by her. To my amazement, she had figured out exactly the same thing I had figured out. I was amazed. We looked at each other and said, oh my, you don't suppose there could be other people who figured this out as well. So we decided to inventory the women faculty in science at MIT and ask them how many people had figured out something like this, if they had at all. Was it really true? And that was when we made that startling discovery that in 1994 there only were 15 tenured women and 197 tenured men. It made it easy to do the polling. In fact, I said to her, it's not possible. It couldn't be possible there are only 15. I bet they list them separately in the book. Just go somewhere else in the back of the book, maybe the women listed separately. So we went through the entire catalog from page 1 to the last page. We discovered 2 women who were actually in the School of Engineering but had joint appointments in science, and then we brought our number up to 17. And we went and polled them all, and 16 out of 17, there was a range of responses, but in the end, 16 out of 17 signed a letter written to the Dean of Science that said, we believe there is unconscious bias against women here. We don't think anyone knows about it, but we have seen it, and we think it causes women to drop out and makes their lives harder. We'd like to have a committee formed where we can study it. So if we could collect the data, collect the women's experiences, and put them down, you'll be able to understand it, and then you can fix it. You can imagine the delight of the dean upon hearing this good news. But he was a wonderful man named Bob Birgeneau who took it on and became the chancellor of Berkeley. He's just stepping down now as president of Berkeley and just won an enormous prize in physics. He's a physicist, and he just won one of the leading prizes, in part for agreeing to allow these women to study this problem. And we could not have done it without him, and it was a remarkable thing. So a committee was formed to study this, and it had 6 tenured women faculty and 3 male professors who were all department chairs in the School of Science. Of course, the men were needed to give the committee credibility, because who would believe a bunch of tenured women faculty at MIT? I chaired the committee. We interviewed the women faculty and department heads, and we collected data, and we found a very clear pattern, even though it was a small group of people in different fields, different departments, different everything, but the same pattern. Each generation of women came in that system, just as I had, believing gender discrimination was a thing of the past. But as they progressed through their careers, as they aged, as they went through tenure and on, usually around 50, they were gradually marginalized. They were excluded from access to resources and professional activities, rewards and compensations that make MIT one of the most superb environments in which you can do science. And that exclusion renders the job more difficult and less fun. The women who got tenure were hugely successful scientifically, but they often achieved their success by working alone, raising all their funding alone, not having children, not being married. And the women suggested their negative experiences and how they were perceived could easily influence another generation of young women not to want to be like them. In fact, women used to say, I don't want to be like you. Well, that couldn't be more clear-cut. So I think that there's no question that this word that came to sum up their lives, marginalization as they aged, is another contributor to the leaky pipeline. So in response to our confidential report, this wonderful Dean Birgeneau immediately corrected all the inequities that he could that had been documented by this committee. And he also said, the answer to this problem is more women. So this man, on his own, went running around to departments, said, give me the names of the best women in the field that you know. So collected this, and then he got on an airplane, he went after those women, and he stalked them, he recruited them aggressively, and he was very successful. And here's Bob Birgeneau, and there is the second jump in the curve, and that jump is the Bob Birgeneau bump, we call it, because it's the direct result of the efforts this one man made to address this problem. Well, wonderful as all of that was, and it was wonderful. It was life-changing, I should say. Everything changed. I never was really unhappy again, I should say. I mean, because somebody had heard you and somebody had recognized there was a problem and done something about it. And you saw that it really was a real problem. But if that had been all of it, then, of course, it would have had a short impact, but it would have gradually slid right back. So the question is, you know, how do you take something like that and make these problems not keep occurring again and again and again? Well, what happened at MIT is that the chair of the faculty in 1999 was a woman named Lottie Balin, who's a professor in the Sloan School of Management. And her interest has been her own personal professional work. Her professional work at MIT in her career has been balancing family and work in companies. She's worked with many, many companies on this issue. So this was a topic she was very interested in. And one of the women in our group, by the way, our group had operated in total secrecy. Women were afraid if people heard about what they were doing, they would think they were a bunch of radical feminists, and heaven forfend, and then nobody would speak to them or whatever. Some terrible thing would happen. So the women kind of met in secret, and Bob Birgeneau did all of his work, but most faculty had no idea that anything had taken place. But Lottie knew one of the women in the group, and she did know, and so she asked me to write a summary of what our committee had done and what they'd found. And so I wrote a summary to appear in the MIT faculty newsletter, but by chance, it ended up on the front page of the New York Times, of all things. And the reaction to this was something we could not have really imagined. Honestly, at the time, 99, I thought, this is a problem for a tiny number of women who want to be elite scientists. Who cares about them? And of course, we know that, you know, the same problems exist at Harvard and, you know, Berkeley and Stanford and whatever. But other than that, you know, who cares? So we were not prepared, certainly not prepared. Well, first of all, why would somebody put it on the front page of the New York Times? We should have realized then that there was something to this, but I didn't. But when this hit the front page, we were just overwhelmed by women, the president of MIT, the dean of science, myself, Lottie, women writing saying, you won't believe it, I've got exactly the same problem in my institution, nobody will listen to me. So suddenly we realized this was a really major problem. And I was, a few weeks later, invited to the White House, where the Clintons, you know, endorsed this study and said every university in the state should do it. So we went from obscurity and meeting in secret to this national thing. So what caused this report to have this impact? Well, one is obviously women had been experiencing these problems in the workplace and nobody could say it because they were too afraid, or when they did say it, they were silenced. But really it was the courage of our president at the time, President Vest of MIT, this extraordinary man who read the report and believed it and made this comment. I've always believed that contemporary gender discrimination with universities is part reality, part perception. True, but I now understand that reality is by far the greater part of the balance. People think, now people will say he did it to be politically correct. At the time he did it, nobody else would do it. And so it was a real act of courage, and it really changed MIT. And I think the third reason that the report had the impact was the quality of the women. I actually took the slide out because I wanted to shorten my talk, but of the original 16 women who got together and wrote to Dean Birgeneau to say there was bias, 4 of them have won the United States National Medal of Science, which is our equivalent of the Nobel Prize, and 70% of them are members of the National Academy. So these were women who were highly visible international scientists, and yet they were saying there's a problem. It was hard to say this, and to this day, most women will not say publicly. They don't want to talk about it publicly because of this perception that if you were really good enough, this wouldn't happen to you. But these women were good enough, and it did happen to them. And so I think that was the third reason that it had an impact. Well, after you figure all that out, the question is, how do you change the institution? And with this pressure from the public, after it became public, I mean, the president of MIT was called by all these various organizations, well, now that you've figured out this problem, we expect you to fix it for the United States. Poor President Vest, he said, we identified a problem, we don't know how to fix it either. We are just identifying it. We now have to turn our attention to seeing if we can fix it. So the question is, how do you make the kinds of changes Bob Birgeneau made individually, but embed them in the whole structure of that institution so these things don't keep happening? And that's called making institutional change. And again, I don't want to go into a lot of this. I know we're going to talk later in the week, some of us, about how you do this. But it's really here that the world gets changed in a way. This is how institutions truly get changed. Policies get written, new procedures get put into place, and so forth. So it is a terribly important thing, obviously. And here's a summary of the issues that had been identified. I should say, going back here, this is just the administrative structure of MIT. There's a president, a provost, 5 deans of the 5 schools, and underneath those are the department heads. And these were the problems that had to be addressed: the unequal distribution of resources and rewards that occurs as people are marginalized, the family work conflict for junior women, the small number of women faculty, the fact there'd never been a female department head in the School of Science or Engineering in the history of MIT, or above that, of course, and then this difficult thing of the marginalization and undervaluation for equal work. So what do you do about these things? And I think they fall in 2 groups. Okay, so one of them are things where you can sort of take administrative action and you can make policy. Okay. The tough one is this marginalization and undervaluation. And we're going to talk a lot about this week, I think, about this. It's very interesting. But I remember back in about, I think it was either 2001 or 2002, we were sitting around the room trying to figure out, how do you solve these problems? Where do we start? And President Vest made an interesting comment. He said, fixing inequities, by which he meant inequities of resources, salary, space, etc. He said, that's easy. We know how to do that. I was fainting with gratitude because I didn't know how to do it and I couldn't believe it was doable. But he said, that's easy, we'll do that. Okay, so I was already, just do that, I'll be happy. But he said, how do you fix marginalization? He said, I don't know how you fix that. So, okay, let's just turn to the easy problems to fix. What do you do? I should say the approach that he took was, we'll take women who understand the problem and we'll partner them with people in the university who have the power to make change, to make policy, to make institutional change. And that's what they basically did. So they created a position at the highest academic administrative level of the university, and he appointed me to hold it for the first appointment. And I worked there, sat on those committees, saw how the university worked with the provost, and we addressed the various problems as we could. He also, at the dean's level, there were committees established in all 5 schools, and they were chaired by women faculty. So those committees were meeting with the deans, so the problems were identified. I met with the heads of those committees, so it created a network of women faculty from the top to the faculty level at every level of the administration. So as things bubbled up fast, and we talked about them, and policy was made to the extent you could, and it was discussed by a lot of people. And I think that this was a very effective approach to the problem, and it's evolved. And the most important thing is when Vest stepped down, the next president, who, unbelievable, was a woman, and the one after her, have continued this. So this whole thing has to maintain itself for a long time because the fixes are very slow. So what changed? And basically, equity was ensured very quickly. As he said, it's not that hard to do. It was reviewed by the people who knew where and how to look, and there were mechanisms to quickly fix the things. Women were recruited to the academic administration, and then these novel positions were created to bring them to these high levels much more quickly. You can't just instantly produce a female dean or a female department head. It's not easy to do. But you could create these positions that brought them to the top very fast. really important, the family leave policies were rewritten to be uniform for the university and discussed by so many people, by Lottie Balin leading all of this, with all the women faculty discussing it with deans and department heads, that it took the stigma out of it and it made them something that's sort of become almost as routine as taking a sabbatical. The women asked for a large daycare center in the middle of the campus, and by God, they built one. It's amazing. So we never could say the word baby. Suddenly there were babies everywhere, babies being pushed by fathers, by mothers in the middle of the computer science building. A glass-walled infant care center in the biology lobby. I mean, so these were unimaginable changes that occurred. The procedures for recruiting women had to be addressed and have been in many ways. I won't go into the detail, but you basically have to educate people to unconscious bias, you have to review the numbers, you have to constantly look. The hiring rate is so slow. You could go 10 years, not make any progress, and not even know you're making no progress, because the turnover rates of faculty are very slow. Then this network of committees connected the women so that the marginalization, they might be marginalized within their field, but at least they weren't marginalized within the university. And then the president of MIT invited the presidents of 8 other universities to come to MIT and come and make a commitment to do this in their schools, and then to keep meeting and sharing best practices, and that's continued to this day. So, all of those things happen. What about the number of women faculty? Well, there you see the famous Birgeneau bump, and then Bob Birgeneau left to become a university president, and the curve went flat. Hey, how did that happen? And then it goes up again. And how did such a thing? So a committee was appointed. Why did the curve go flat? So it turned out that the next dean had made a number of offers to women, but the women didn't accept. So the dean who came in after him said, I'm on it. And he appointed a woman named Hazel Siv, who's a professor of biology, to be an associate dean to work with him. And they interviewed all the women who applied. They set up yet more rules for how to run search committees and so forth, and they produced the next jump in this curve. So that's the Dean Kastner Hazel Siv bump. And I think what it shows you is you stop paying attention and it goes backwards again. Oh, it flattens out. So this slide summarizes where we are today in terms of the number of women faculty in science and engineering at MIT as of a year ago. Okay, they're red and black. In half the departments, the red ones, the percent of women on the faculty today is the same as the percent of PhDs that MIT produces. Now you could say the pool might be bigger elsewhere, but it tends to be, these schools pretty much look alike. So if MIT looks like this, there's a good chance that Stanford looks like this. And so I use this as just a measure of what the pipeline looks like and what the faculty could look like. And what you see is half the departments, the percent of women on the faculty looks like the women we train, and in the other half, it's less. If you look at those other departments where it's less, the percent of women on the faculty now looks like the percent of women in the applicant pool. So I think it's fair to say there's no bias in the hiring. Women are leaking out in half the departments between getting a PhD and applying to faculty. And in the other half, they're not. But, okay, first of all, I must say, I think this is sort of a triumph. On the other hand, when I look at it and I say, okay, after all this work, where are we? You'll notice 16% of the engineering faculty is women and 18% of the science faculty is women. When I think of how much work this has been, those are pretty low numbers. But the pipelines are pretty low. We'll come back to it. Okay, so then the question comes up again is, if you've been doing this very deliberate attention to hiring, have you been practicing affirmative action? Have the standards fallen off? Here's the current for 2010, men and women who are full professors, who are members of the National Academy of Science, which is the easiest measure of the level of excellence, which is what we strive for. And you see that the women are at the same level of accomplishment as the men in science, and they're the same level of accomplishment as the men in engineering. So no, the quality, you cannot lower the standards in this regard. So, okay, where are we today at MIT? There are women in the academic administration. We've had a woman president. There are 2 to 3 times as many women faculty as there were. We did a survey 2 years ago to see how all the generations of women feel about their faculty, about their jobs. Young women who had no idea whatever happened, this all came about, take it, of course, for granted that all these things are the way the world is. And they love MIT. They love their jobs. They think everything's wonderful. They feel privileged to be there, and they're right. If you can be a faculty member at MIT, you have the best shot at doing great science because of the resources that are available there. The older women can't believe this happened in their lifetime. Honestly, the ones who came from where I am are just thrilled with what happened. So, is everything fixed? Not yet. Well, first of all, there are those very low numbers. In some fields, the pipeline is still very small, and in some it still leaks. We also know if you stop paying attention, the numbers slide backwards very quickly because the number of women is still small. It's hard work to find people who are in lesser numbers. It's just harder work. We also know people can be overlooked, and we also know that women who should apply don't apply necessarily. So there's multiple reasons. So you have to keep paying attention, and the women who now do this work, I no longer do this work for MIT and haven't for several years, but the ones who do believe you'll have to do this for at least another 10 years, if not 20. I think there are two remaining problems that I know about that still contribute to women leaving the pipeline at different stages. One is still the family work issue. And despite the institutional changes that have been done, and there's the fact that it's now socially acceptable and that all now junior faculty do have, in contrast to my generation, they do have children do it, I still think this is a pretty hard job for balancing family and work, and that we haven't yet solved this. Until men and women are equal at work and equal in the home, how can women be equal at work if they're not equal in the home? So that's one issue. But the other one, I think, brings me back to President Vest's comment that was so interesting a dozen years ago when he said, how do you fix marginalization? Which I think is really a manifestation of unconscious gender bias. Well, once universities understood the consequences of unconscious bias, marginalization, they were able to address a lot of the damage it does by measuring, by monitoring, by checking data, and by correcting. But I think what Chuck Vest was really talking about is, how do you change people's thinking so it doesn't happen in the first place? And I'm hoping that somebody's going to tell me the answer here this week. That's why I came to Dublin. So we're having this interesting meeting this week, and I'm looking for answers. But here are some examples that show that at MIT we may not have solved it yet, and I don't think the rest of the world has yet solved it. Okay, so consider this. Here is the field of biology at MIT, all lines except the last. 70% of biology undergraduate majors today are women, 7-0. And part of it is so many women go into medicine now. And at MIT, either you major in science or you major in engineering. So people don't go off and major in history and then go to medical school. They major in biology and go to medical school. Okay, so that's one reason it's so high. But 53% of the PhD students in biology at MIT are women. 41% of the postdocs, the biology faculty, 26% of our faculty, both junior and senior, are women, and 40% of our neuroscience department faculty is women. But now you look at an activity that is biology related that occurs outside the university, and that is the founding of biotechnology companies and serving on the scientific advisory boards of these companies. And a national study that was done said that that number is only 5 to 7%. Okay, so a couple of years ago, about a year and a half ago, a woman from Harvard Business School came to see me who had seen a list of 100 scientists in the Boston area who had been funded by a venture capital firm to start biotech companies. There were 100 names on the list. Would anybody care to guess how many were women? One. It was one. So I thought, whoa. The reason, by the way, that these national studies had been done is that people have wondered very much in the United States, why in Silicon Valley aren't women founding companies and serving on SABs? And the argument has always been because so few women major in computer science. Very few women get PhDs in computer science, less than 20%. So the pipeline was given as the explanation. They did the studies in biology where there is no pipeline problem to see what the answer was, and the answer turns out it's not the pipeline, okay? So how do you found a biotech company? What is an SAB? How do people get on them? In the United States, many companies are started by university professors who keep their jobs in the university, but work with venture capitalists to take an idea or a finding and turn it into a company. There's usually several, 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 founders, a board of directors who are usually venture capitalists or businessmen, and a scientific advisory board that can have half a dozen to a dozen people. And these are usually faculty in universities and medical schools. You have to be invited to join a scientific advisory board. You do not apply for that job. You're invited, and it's based on who you know and your credentials and your, whatever. And being a faculty member at a place like Harvard Medical School or MIT has a lot of cachet. Some people argue that, in fact, it's a calling card to the venture capital world. Anyway, the question is, what's really important about it, a lot of cutting-edge science goes on in these companies. Huge amounts of information, technology, resources, and interactions occur there. There are some fields of biology where I'd say it would be tough to work in them if you weren't involved in this activity. So the question is, what does this really look like? So after this woman came to see me, I was curious, and I was also asked by some people to look at it. So I Googled the name of a scientist who happened to be, a guy down the hall who I'd read a newspaper article about that day in the newspaper, and typed in the word company, and up came an example. So here's the first example I come upon. Okay, so here's a stem cell company, and it has a management team. I think they're probably businessmen, a board of directors, they're, venture capitalists, whatever, and then a bunch of scientists who were faculty at Harvard and MIT and so forth. 22 men and not one woman. And I'm thinking, boy, that is so weird. I thought it was pretty weird. Okay, so this is a company that's focused on stem cells. So you might think, do you have to be a stem cell biologist to be asked to join this company? So I look up leaders of stem cell biology in the world, and I come up on the web, and up comes a list of 120 people, and the only one who's named is one person out of these 14 is an expert in stem cells, okay? So that doesn't seem to be what determines it. There are, of the list of leading experts in the world, 25% are women. 2 of them happen to be faculty at MIT, but they were not there. So I thought, well, maybe they were asked and they didn't accept. So I asked them, no, nobody asked them. So some of these people are pretty famous, and maybe the women don't have equal credentials, or these people are old, maybe whatever. So, but one of these people is a junior faculty member. He's a 2-year-old junior faculty member. So this is not a question of being old and famous. So the women have superior credentials to many of the people who are here. Perhaps this company is atypical of stem cell companies. So I go and I type in the name of some guy from Harvard, and I look up his stem cell company, 18 men, 1 woman. Well, it's an improvement, I guess. Then I type in the name of some guy from Harvard Medical School who's young, 13 men, 0 women. So I'm sort of starting to get the picture. And so after looking at 18 companies, I came out with this data of 18 companies where the faculty founders were from MIT, Harvard, Harvard Medical School, or Sloan Kettering. There were 223 men in the categories that were listed. I just went to the web. I mean, this is not deep data. This is taken off the web. And there were 8 women. If you went down through the list and you asked how many of these people are full-time faculty at Harvard or MIT or Sloan Kettering or whatever, there were 77 men who were full-time faculty and 4 women. So, hey, that's what 5% looks like. So this is, people often say to me, well, by the way, as time went, I continued to be interested in this, so whenever a company name came up in the news, I'd type it in, go look it up. Looked at the West Coast, all the same, didn't look any different. I found one company in Texas that had half women on its SAB. I have to check them out further. I don't know how that happened. Anyway, people often ask me, what does marginalization look like? This is what marginalization looks like. And this is the way the universities were. This is what it was like to be a female professor at MIT 30 years ago. You knew that there was all kinds of activity going on around you. You just weren't part of it. And now the activity, here's another activity. Now you could say, well, why don't women go found their own companies? So I tried to find out if women in School of Science had founded their own companies, and could find only 1 woman. But of course I wouldn't necessarily have access. So bottom line, after looking at this, I was horrified, because 30 years ago, when the biotech industry was founded, I had shared an office with a man who was founding a company. He said, gee, I'd like to invite you to join, but I can't because businessmen won't work with women. I said, of course they won't. So it's like the friends, of course businessmen don't work with women. I'm not offended. I know that. Thank you for asking. So that was 30 years ago. I thought something would have changed by now. But I don't know why this looks like this. I don't know. Anyway, I showed this data to some of the men involved, and they didn't know either. And I showed it to some female colleagues. In the end, we wrote to the provost at MIT and asked him to collect the data for all the faculty in science and engineering, so we can figure out what the real data say. How many men, how many women found companies, in companies founded by men and women, how many women and men serve on the SABs? Because it's a very important thing to know, because if women aren't doing this, their work is not getting out to the public, which is actually the point of a lot of this work, is to benefit the world. And if they're not forming companies, they're not benefiting the world. If they're not participating in men's companies, they're not having access to the information and technology and resources you absolutely need in some fields of science today. So I could go on and on, but I'm not going to. I'll just close with one example, which I think a lot of people saw. People say, does unconscious bias still exist? And if you care to look it up, in 2012 it still existed, according to a study done by Joe Handelsman's group at Yale, where they found the same issue, that women and men who, in this case, the reason this was published, it's both women and men who are science faculty in universities in America today still believe an identical man is better than an identical woman. And so this just is updating the fact that this is still an issue. So there is progress. These are women Nobel Prize winners I've actually known myself. And you'll notice that the number is increasing. But it's still a ways to go. Thank you very much. Sure. Sure. Mm-hmm.
So thank you very much, Professor Hopkins, for a really vivid and engaging account of the story of change at MIT. As you said, the data was from MIT, but the story is a more general one, and one I think will have resonances with many of the audience here tonight. I understand that you're prepared to answer some questions for a short while. So I'd just like to invite the audience to ask your question, and maybe if you could say, who you are and what institution you come from or what your interests are as well. So just open the floor. Yes.
Yeah. I admire you greatly for coming, but honestly, also women who aren't here. And you said that women are aware of this. Honestly, I was not aware of it when I was young. And I think part of the reason is, I don't think, well, there's two things. I think the fact that there's no women president in the United States and people aren't out in the streets protesting, that's one problem. We accept the world as it is, and when you're young, you just want to get on with it, right? You want to just make your way. As long as you're making your way, you're going to keep going. You're not going to stop and worry about it. Yeah. Well, first of all, thank you to each and every individual man who is here. I admire you greatly for coming, but honestly, also women who aren't here. And you said that women are aware of this. Honestly, I was not aware of it when I was young. And I think part of the reason is, I don't think, well, there's two things. I think the fact that there's no women president of the United States and people aren't out in the streets protesting, that's one problem. We accept the world as it is, and when you're young, you just want to get on with it, right? You want to just make your way. As long as you're making your way, you're going to keep going. You're not going to stop and worry about this problem. And you shouldn't, really, I just thought. And I think that young women often don't have a problem. I mean, how many years ago is it? I met Jim Watson in 1963. I worked in his lab in, the late 60s, early 70s. I wasn't having a problem. He encouraged me to be a scientist. I think that when the person's a student, they are seen in a different category. The problem really comes as women move into equal power with men. That seems to be where they get pushed aside. So the question is, what do you do about it? Should you tell young women about this or leave them alone? And my feeling always was, leave them alone. It's up to us who did get through somehow or other. And believe me, I wouldn't do it again, honestly. As much as I love science, couldn't live without it, I wouldn't do this again. I mean, I wouldn't have tried to be a scientist if I'd known what was coming. I wouldn't have done it, I don't think. It was ridiculous. It really was. But don't listen to that. Okay. But the ones I thought it was up to the ones who got through to do what I'm doing, right? And fix it for the people who came after so they don't have to do it. But I'm not sure. And there's this Sheryl Sandberg movement afoot. Has everybody read about Sheryl Sandberg? No. Oh boy. Well, do go and Google Sheryl Sandberg. She is the COO of Facebook. And she's trying to take this problem on in the business world. She says she's 44 years old. She said it's already too late for her generation. They are not going to make it to the top in business in her generation. It's too late. They've already dropped out. So she's taken it on, and she's urging the women to change their attitudes. My feeling is that the women of my generation, we went through this in the 60s, 70s with women were told, you can do anything, get out there, do it. And that's why we are where we got where we got. Definitely is. But very few could do it because People weren't willing to not have children. They weren't willing to deal with being taught. If I told you the stories of things that happened, I mean, Francis Crick, that was nothing. That wasn't the problem. The problem was this, it's just impossible to even, you can't even tell the stories because people don't even believe them. Okay, so those are the real problems. So, what is the solution? Come on, this is it. This is the question. Should young women be told there's a problem when they don't experience it? I mean, one thing for sure, there should be more older women in this room. You know, we do acknowledge the men who come because we know they're amazing. Okay, but so are the women who are here today amazing. I mean, and I used to forgive everybody who wouldn't speak out because you do get tainted by speaking out. But if more spoke out, maybe they wouldn't. You know, the women just want to be scientists. They just want to be successful like everybody else. They just love science. They want to be scientists. They don't want to talk about this. So what do we do? How do we make it a sort of a collective problem? Because it isn't going to be solved without men. Can't be. Cannot be. What's the answer? Let's call on some men here. Speak up. Let's have everybody to speak up. You know, what's the answer?
Hi, Monia McCarthy, just from Classic Fantasy. You just mentioned Sharon Sandberg, and yes, she's doing wonderful work. And then you have Marissa Meyer from BMU undoing it all, it seems. I'm not really sure, but it's a very sort of different approach. I mean, this week she's come out.
I don't think so.
Know.
I think Marissa Meyer is, well, I don't know. I mean, I've dealt with both, actually. Go ahead, I'm sorry, I didn't cut you
I
off.
guess, just from reading what you read in the media about both, you're sort of conflicting, you're sort of a little bit conflicted, and you don't know what to think of what Marissa Meyer's approach is. And I'm a little conflicted, actually.
Well, I think Marissa Meyer, I happened to hear her talk at MIT last year. She's one of my heroines. They're both heroines, I think. I think she worked at Google in the early days of Google when she was the 12th employee or something. They worked 120 hours a week. 120 hours a week. And when she said that, it was a room full of women students at the Sloan School, and there was Marissa Meyer, and she was talking, and they were all very eager to hear this heroine, talk about her career. And she's beautiful, and she's just fabulous. She's brilliant. She's amazing. And then she said that, and I could see the deflation in the room. 120 hours a week. Well, that's what it took to make Google. Those young people, that's what they did. And that's what she wants to do. And she loves doing that. And she's saying, if you don't want to do that, okay, fine, but you're not going to be part of my company. Because this company's going to go out of business if we don't get our act together. So I think she's doing the right thing for her company at this moment. And, that she should have a nursery next to her office. You're going to work 120 hours a week, you better have a nursery next to your office. So I think they're all part of a changing picture. I think she's an absolute heroine. That she got to where she is inspiring to a whole generation of women. And same with Sheryl Sandberg. I happened to hear Sheryl Sandberg speak at the World Economic Forum in January. And I was kind of disappointed by it because I wanted her to say, I'm going to change the companies. And she didn't. She said, those women have to change and put pressure on the companies. But look, what we're doing, is it working? What we're doing in these universities? Look at the rate of change, and look, the amount of work that's gone into this is huge. Things have changed, yes, hugely. But have they really changed significantly enough? I don't know.
Thank you very much for inspiring speech. My name is Kaporal. I'm a lecturer at University College Dublin. I'm not a woman. I'm not a scientist. As you can see, my mom is a professor in physics. But I spent a lot of time of my childhood in universities. But it was possible. I'm originally from Japan, and it was only possible because my mom's university is women's university, so she could bring me to her university and laboratory. I just wondered, some of the names, male figures you mentioned, presidents, and they are amazing people. And how did you actually make alliance with them? I think that's one of the key things to change men's perceptions. And I can be here because my mom was a physicist, so I went through it with her, and the difficulties and challenges. But a lot of men, I know, they actually cannot really support women because of the club culture they are sort of living in.
The what culture?
Club.
Club culture.
Male club.
That's a key point you just made there.
So how did you sort of make all these changes at MIT, making friends and supporters amongst male professors?
Well, I think when you're young, I mean, I think Jim Watson mentored a number of women. Myself, the woman who became the president of MIT, the woman who became the president of Princeton, another woman, Joan Stites at Yale. He mentored all those women. I think he was genuinely interested in science and students, and I know it's a complicated reputation, very complicated. That's another whole story. But I think, so that's the connection made. But your point about the clubs, I think, is the key. And what I saw at MIT, well, when we first brought this up, it wasn't that Bob Birgeneau said, "Thank you for bringing it to my attention, I'll take it from here." No, it was obstructed. Once they really got it, they really got it. But it took a long time of talking about it. And now at MIT, they have people come into the administration who are really dedicated, men who are just more, dedicated to this than the women. And they're really very active. Our chair of physics is a man who's just totally dedicated to this. So there are a few of them. But the problem is those clubs. It's the VC club. I suspect that it's the problem with this biotech problem. And how do you do that? I mean, one thing in universities is in the United States, if it weren't for the civil rights and affirmative actionists, nothing would have ever happened. And the driving force really is, now this is federally funded work. And women pay taxes too. I mean, and there's a kind of legal sense in which universities want to do it, have to do it, half their students are women. So, but outside in companies, where's the pressure? It only comes from public perception of a company, I think. I actually sent this data of the biotechs to Chuck Vest. And he wrote back and he said, I don't know what I'm looking at. He literally didn't know what he was looking at because he couldn't believe he was looking at what he was looking at. Because he said in public companies, there's actually a pressure to get women on scientific advisory boards. A company would look ridiculous that looked like that. So public pressure, but I don't know,
Hi, Jane Grimson, Trinity. This is slightly tongue-in-cheek, but I'm very taken with the arguments that you put about the affirmative action and legislation and those kind of things. So what do we do now? Well, we're all rather hung up on university rankings, so my suggestion is that one of the criteria should be the percentage of professors who are women.
Here, here. Here, here. Yes, bravo. That's a very good suggestion.
But could I add to that, Jane, that more to the point, a lot of our universities have strategic plans and they have even these key performance indicators and so on. I'm not sure whether I've seen them in other universities, but I don't think I've seen them in any universities in Ireland. Nancy, thank you so much for your talk. I don't know if you realise, you're coming here for answers to how to accelerate social change. You're coming here. Correct me if I'm wrong, I didn't do it, but I think we're probably, with our statistics, we're probably back in the 1980s or thereabouts, We've never had a woman president of a university as far as I'm aware. In Ireland, we're lucky here to be graced by two. I taught myself at one university. And the stats are way down, I think, is not right mining. So we need to put all those structural changes into place and all that rapid redress and everything like that, and all of the role models and everything at the same time. And we need to do it really quickly as well. And then we need to figure out how to talk to people in MIT. Maybe you're looking at accelerating your social and cultural changes, but we're way back.
Oh dear.
Thank you very much for that really inspiring presentation. And I'm thinking, what do we do to stop this continuing to happen? And I suppose the only way is to start with children and education, where they grow up in schools feeling equal to each other and appreciating, that they are equal. I mean, that's the big problem, because at a very young age, children start forming opinions of what girls can do and what boys can do. So,
I mean, the psychologists who do this research have tried to figure out how old is a person when they acquire these beliefs.
I think 1.
They say 3 to 9 months.
Yeah, I would say 3 to 9 months.
So you have to start that education very young.
Because otherwise we'll continue to have this problem. I mean, it's wonderful to have that data. Fantastic. And, we'll have to ask our Vice Provost to have a big look at Trinity.
Well, maybe it's time for the chair of WiSER or director of WiSER to say a little about the programme for the next weekend and more broadly about WiSER and the Integer project as we finish this. But I think you are right. It does seem to me that the significant change that MIT has managed to create, you're saying, is not sustainable unless there is consistent effort to maintain that. So even where, it does seem to me that the monumental effort it's taken is something, it has to be a priority. It can't be just one among a whole series of initiatives, but it has to be one of the priorities. And even then, the commitment to sustainability has to be maintained. So I think it is a very long road for us here, but WiSER and the Integer project, we hope, is going to give some of the momentum to that, continue to give the momentum to that. So I'll hand over to Professor Drew to conclude the evening.
Thank you very much. Yes, certainly there was a lot. I received your talk in advance and it was inspirational. It made me rethink and revisit where MIT was, and as Neve said, where Trinity, well, how do we compare? And I can speak quite frankly and tell you that when I came to Trinity as an undergraduate in natural sciences, there was not one woman in faculty that I can recall. I wasn't taught by one woman lecturer over a period of 4 years, not one. And I've graduated in geography, which should have been veering towards, it would probably be the majority of students in geography would have been, even then, would have been female. So I've been looking at that pipeline for quite a lot of decades and waiting for things to change, waiting for it to get better. So I really appreciate that you pointed out that it takes more than the legislation. We have to have that. It takes more than time and it will rectify itself. It doesn't. And I think what you were describing in that really inspirational graph is very like, there's an author called Duran who talks about breakthrough and control. And it's the breakthrough is where there's an intervention. And this was talking about quality, but as an engineer, he had grasped exactly what's described in that if you wait, things get better and there's an upward trajectory, you can forget it. So what do we need? And you've come to some very important conclusions that we've been working through here. It was great to see you had so many inspirational people work with you at all sorts of levels. And I'd like to feel we're now in that phase at the moment. We have a new provost, new vice provosts, and we feel that the ground is now set for moving along through. I think the importance you drew to them as champions is very important, and that women cannot and should not need to do it for themselves, because this is for the benefit of society and the girls and boys of future generations. So men, not only do we not welcome them, we welcome them with open arms, but it's almost a necessity, because it is the right thing that we should be working together on this and looking for role models, as you say, that are appealing, that will make young women who are doing their degree, doing their PhD, say, I want to do it. And certainly from a work-family conflict point of view, that was my motivation for coming into academia. I saw it as the only possible route where I could have it all, and I managed to. So I think that we should broadcast that there are all possibilities. The day nursery on campus, Trinity was well ahead, had one in the 70s. So we have done some things. And we've produced in Ireland 2 female presidents, which, as you say, you haven't done in the States yet either. The importance of data is going to be critical. It feeds into policy. It must be monitored. We have to be vigilant. and we have to address the family-work conflict and turn that into work-life balance for male and female staff, because that's the only way forward. And I absolutely applaud your proposal, and I think it should be formally minuted, Jane, for a KPI that should become not only what Trinity is working towards, but what the whole higher institutes of education should be working towards, and the international rankings globally. Because if it became part of the rankings, then you would see that people would fall in line very, very quickly and conform to what's measured, what's recognised, and what there's follow through on. And it would be wonderful to see that happen. And I think that it would give me the confidence to say, I'm optimistic. We have reason to be optimistic, and we're all going to go away from this International Women's Week and say, we are going to change the world, and that's you men with us as well, because we need you all. So before going on any further, I just want to say thank you all of you for coming along and giving your time and being here to share what has been absolutely, Nancy is such a charismatic speaker, and it's wonderful to have somebody of such calibre come all this way and speak to us. I want to thank also the European Commission for making it possible to have the premises here, because we couldn't get premises in Trinity because of International Women's Week. Some people got in ahead of us. Thank our Vice Provost very kindly for bringing the whole topic, dealing with the questions and inviting and supporting our speaker, and we very much thank you very much for that. I want to thank the WiSER team. We're now the 3 WiSER women. That's Claire Marshall, who's at the front here, that some of you will be familiar with, and Evelyn Murphy at the back there. It's been quite a week because, as you know, we're moving into now integer mode. We're moving away from the WiSER activities, which many of you will have attended before, we'll be addressing institutional change. And that will be the business of this week. That is where we'll be pooling these ideas, drawing upon your expertise and other invited guests from the UK, with our partner CNRS, with our partners GASIS from Germany, and with our partners from Shaolei University, who haven't actually flown in here yet. So this is only the beginning. It's not the end of our week, and we thought it was very fortuitous and auspicious that we should be doing this work in International Women's Week. So finally, I just want to say thank you so much, Nancy, and to say it's not beautifully gift wrapped, but we wanted you to accept something as a souvenir from Trinity and our card. And also, this may be familiar to some of you, but it's also the work of a fellow woman academic, a professor in Trinity College, Susan Parks, and it's called A Danger to the Men. Because as we all know, there are various pretexts for keeping women in their place. And at one time it was that we would be morally corrupting the young men of 100 and something years ago. That was the justification. So it's a very good read. It's worth remembering. If you think you're disheartened, you won't be if you read this. There is some good news at the end. Thank you all again for coming.